Hello, my name is Owen, and welcome to a quick review of Mercury by Amy Jo Burns. What I want to do is give a brief overview of the book's about, tell you the things that I liked, and tell you the things that I didn't like, and answer the question, can Barnes & Noble be trusted? Barnes & Noble? What's Barnes & Noble got to do with this? Well, if you look right here, there's a little sticker that says Barnes & Noble Book Club. What you're looking at right here, folks, is the book of the month for the month of January of this year for Barnes & Noble. Now, obviously, we're many months beyond January, right? And the marketing for this book has all but disappeared from my eyes. I walked into a Barnes & Noble the other week, not even a sniff of it on the shelves. Must not have been a slam dunk hit for them. But did it deserve a monthly spot? What determines a monthly spot, a book of the month at Barnes & Noble, right? Because other than my local indie bookstore, which I just go in for random finds, that you just discover something there. I'm like, oh, I guess I'll read that. You can't really search for things very well at most smaller bookstores because, their inventory is a little bit more limited, right? You either got the ultra popular stuff or you got the most obscure things you've ever read before in your life. But if I'm looking for a specific book, I do go to Barnes & Noble, and they're always throwing these book of the months at you. Now, I don't have the patience or the energy to research how they choose their book of the months. Is it by is there a group of people who sit around, or is it whoever gives them the most money? Quite frankly, I have no idea. And I don't care to find the answer myself. So if someone knows, that'd be great. I do know that Barnes & Noble as a company is trying to move more towards the book lovers type store. So I highly doubt it's as cynical as Amy Jo Burns just gave him $1 million and said, "You're going to promote me in January." I doubt it. But in general, from what I've read of their books of the month, the books that they tote a lot, they're a little bit more artistic. They're a little bit more flowery, right? A little deep. But I went into this book completely blind. They were throwing it at me when I was in a Barnes & Noble in January. I said, you know what the heck? Let's give it a shot. Let's see what it's all about. Never heard of the author. Didn't even read the synopsis. Just barely glanced over it. But you know what? I was excited to read it, and I'm glad I did. And I'll get into why pretty soon. So this takes place in Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, guys. This is my neck of the woods here. And it follows a woman named Marley as she moves into this small town, and she becomes intertwined into the lives of the Joseph family, the wife, the father, and the 3 boys. And she becomes intertwined in their lives, and it's kind of over many years in the 90s, follows these characters' progressions in this small town as they feel the shackles of a small town Western PA, man. It's tough out there. It is. My experience was not at all similar to this book, just in case you end up reading it. But it was... How can I describe this book? It reminded me a bit of Beartown by Frederick Bachman, which is a trilogy that I really, really enjoyed. Not in terms of the style of writing, because Bachman kind of has this serious. He writes about serious topics, but he kind of adds an air of levity a lot of times. He knows how to intersperse drama and comedy. But Beartown is a little bit more, leans more toward the serious side. But it reminded me of that because of how desperately sad this book is. Miss Amy Jo Burns is not afraid to beat the crap out of her characters emotionally. And that's what it reminded me of Beartown, where it's just you're just witnessing tragedy in a small town, essentially. And it's very, very tight on this Joseph family and Marley. And overall, I would say it's a tight narrative. And for that, I do got to give it credit for. I thought the story itself, the plot, was interesting. The characters were gripping. I felt myself invested in these family members, which is the heart and soul of this book, is the specific members of the Joseph family that we focus on. I think it has a great message about, it has the classic stuck in a small town, stuck in your family tradition, stuff like that, type themes that you commonly see with these types of books. But it also explores the nature of being a mother, being a wife, but it also kind of deconstructs the patriarchy. No, it doesn't deconstruct the patriarchy, but the patriarch character framework, right? Because the only character in this Joseph family that doesn't get dedicated POVs inside their head is the patriarch, is in this character Mick Joseph, right? And we see him from all the different characters' perspectives, and we see how him leading this family and how everyone is there to serve him. He owns the business, he's the go-getter, he's the charmer. We see him through all these characters' perspectives, and it provides a very interesting look into that type of character, which I feel like a lot of other books' protagonists would be this father, this entrepreneur, this go-getter, this war veteran, as this character fought in Vietnam. But instead, Burns explores all the other characters around him and how it had a detrimental effect on their lives. It's very, very interesting. It's a very interesting idea to explore. And quite frankly, I enjoyed it. I do think, just to kind of get to the Barnes & Noble question, I could see why this was a book of the month, though, like I said, judging from their marketing of the book since January, I'm going to guess it didn't do the numbers that they were hoping for. But I thought this was a really, really high quality book. I don't always go for the more serious family drama type books. It was a nice change of pace in that regard for certain. I will say that the only negatives I have, two negatives. And the first one is just a matter of taste, right? It is kind of exhausting to read just this endless misery of these characters. Now, I do think Burns does a good job of ending on a note of hope, which I think is important for a lot of books in this style, where it's just endless sadness. These characters are getting beaten down. The weight of the world is too much on them, like those types of books. And this is just my artistic preference, guys, not to get super deep on you, but I think that if you're going to write a story like that, if you're going to explore that in an art form, to end on at least a sliver of hope, it just feels more right to me. I think just movies or books or shows that just leave you with nothing. I understand why some people like them, some like a good cry or whatever, but a book or a movie can be sad, but that doesn't mean it has to be. The word that's coming to me is fruitless, right? Because sometimes you'll just beat up on your characters for an entire book, and it'll just end on, and that's the way life's unfair. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe that's true, but you know what? These are supposed to be an escape, right? Not that every book has to have a happy ending, but you got to give us something to latch onto for the goodness of humanity, right? That's just my personal preference. And to Amy Jo Burns' credit, she does give me that glimmer of hope that I was hoping for at the end, but it is exhausting to read a book about just endless sadness, because these are characters that you do grow to care about, and just to see all the hardship they go through is tough. And that's why it reminded me of Beartown as well, because Bachman in those trilogy of books just beats the crap out of his characters. And that was a trilogy, so it was just like every single book, you're like, oh man, please just write him out of the book. He has a happy ending. Oh no, we're bringing him back to Beartown, and he's going to get another whacking from the third book. And you're like, oh my gosh. But Bachman was good at that as well, as adding that glimmer of hope, which I think redeems these books. And makes them favorites rather than just like explorations of grief or like despair. I don't know. But the only negative I would say that maybe is a little bit less, obviously it's all my taste, but a little bit less tasty is the way that it gets a little flowery at times. And like I said, it's what these book of the months are kind of like, right? They always go for their artistic choice. Makes sense, right? Because these are the types of books that Barnes & Noble at least feels will most likely become classics, like 40 years down the line. Does that make sense? Like, it's not going to be your fantasy romance, right? It's not going to be your book 3 of a sci-fi series. It's going to be a classic 70 years down the line. Obviously, there are exceptions to that. Obviously, I'm reading the Dune series, which is a classic book that's also sci-fi. I'm just saying, more than likely, it's going to be a piece of literary fiction. It's going to be a drama. It's going to be serious. It's going to be deep. It's going to be thematic. But this is a book that sometimes teeters the line of trying too hard to get a point across. I think the themes are really well laid out in this book, and I do think it's really well written. But there are moments where it's just like characters are having conversations. They're only speaking in like one-liners, like deep lines. And there's one point where one of the characters says something along the lines of like, all I see around me is decay. And I'm like, as someone who grew up in Western Pennsylvania, I don't think I've heard a single poem uttered from anybody in that entire half of the state. Just listen. I'm sure there's poets out there. I mean, look at me. I mean, I look like I could be a poet, right? But you know what? There's not nearly enough yins. There's not nearly enough gobs eaten in this book to be a true depiction of Western Pennsylvania. And maybe that's just the specific area I was in, right? But it's just like there's times where these characters speak in such like grandiose Shakespearean metaphor that you just kind of, it took me out of it a little bit, where it's like, okay, we've gone away from a book a little bit, we've gone into poetry a little bit, and for the most part, it wasn't that bad. I've read far, far worse in that regard. But there were a handful of moments where I'm like, okay, right? The author comes through the story, if that makes sense. We kind of got away from that rustic feel of these characters and got into like, I am an author who writes literature. You know what I mean? But that being said, overall, you know what? I had a good time. I think I like the diversity in genres that I have been reading these last few months, and I think reading more serious literary fiction, family drama, a little bit on the sadder side was a nice change of pace for me. That being said, though, I've been kind of on like a depressing streak, right? We had Dune Messiah, wasn't the happiest book of all time, if I'm being honest. Then we had The Grace of Kings, which wasn't the most upbeat fantasy book of all time, if I'm being honest with you. Then I just read this slammer, this depressing slammer of a family drama. But like I said, I think it ended on a high note, so I feel a little bit better about myself. But if this book would have ended at like the 3/4 point, I'd be like, what is life, right? What's the meaning of it all? But you don't want to walk away from a book, a piece of entertainment, asking yourself, what's it all for? That's not what books are. That's not what books are all about, my friend. They're about happiness. They're about making you happy. They're not about happiness. They're about making you happy. At least in my opinion, right? That's why we're all here, right? To have a little bit of fun, to enjoy yourselves a little bit. I don't know, perhaps. But this isn't the only test of Barnes & Noble. Overall, I'd say, you know what? It's worthy of a book of the month. I give it my stamp of approval. That being said, is it worth $30? Is it worth the $30 I spent on it just because for a little bit of discussion questions at the end? I don't think so. I should have bought this book for $12 maximum. I probably should have got it from the library. Spending $30 on any kind of book in this day and age is, quite frankly, robbery. I don't care what month it is, all right? I don't care if it's your book of the year. That being said, I do plan on reading Barnes & Noble's book of the year. So that'll be another test for Mr. Barnes and Dr. Noble, all right? Is one of them a doctor? Probably not, if I had to guess. And then we also have The Wager. That was the author of the year, the author of Killers of the Flower Moon. I saw that book on the shelf last time I went to Barnes & Noble a couple of weeks ago. So you know what? Maybe David Grant is selling some nice copies. I haven't read that book, though. Is that author of the year worthy, or is it just because a Scorsese movie came out and maybe you thought you needed to dabble into that cash cow, Mr. Barnes and Dr. Noble? Who knows? So we'll read that. We'll read The Heaven and Earth Grocery Store. We'll read that. But in terms of else Barnes & Noble, you know what? That's all the tests I got right now. And that's all I got up my sleeve for. Perhaps I'll dive back into a book of the month later on. But the last one I read, and listen, I'm not even talking about this book anymore. Overall, it's good. I enjoyed it, right? If you get it on the cheap, you get it at the library. I think a lot of people who enjoy the literary fiction genre will get a kick out of it. I think it was a well-written book, and you know what? Quite frankly, Amy Jo Burns, if you release another book, I could be convinced to read it. Which is a great endorsement, because you know what? I don't even read multiple books of authors that I really liked, which means that I thought this was high quality, and I liked the genre, and I liked the way you wrote it. What was I going to say? Oh, the last Barnes & Noble book I read. Silly me. It was Tomorrow, right? That was their book of the month in like August of 2022 or something like that. That book exploded in popularity. I thought it was okay. I thought it was a little bit worse than Mercury, but it was one of those things where it's like, you know, the author's like super artistic. They got they're very author-minded. And I don't know if that's a valid insight into specific author styles, like your author-like, but I feel like you guys know what I'm talking about when I say that. It's people that write, and you know that like they know how to write, and they know like how they're supposed to write. You know what I mean? Like they're not just like, it didn't just puke out of them. Like they like thought about it. And I feel like the more I explain it, the less sense it makes out loud. but you know what I'm talking about. You know that they're thinking about it more than someone who just like wrote it. You know what I mean? I got a good sixth sense for these kind of things. I can tell, like, even specific paragraph by paragraph, how much the author thought about it when they were writing it. Because listen, I wrote the occasional thing in my day. Wouldn't call myself an author. No, sir, I wouldn't. But you know what? You're writing a little short story for English class. There's some paragraphs you just think on. You're like, how can I make this sound deep? How can I make it sound wise? And this book was guilty of that a little bit. There's some paragraphs I'm like, you thought about it. You thought about that paragraph really hard. And it came through. And not to say it's bad, obviously. No, I thought this book was good, in fact. But I can tell you thought about it. Just saying. Just an observation. Just a word of warning to all you authors out there. Is if I read your book, I know when you're thinking. And you know what? Quite frankly, that makes me one of the scariest critics of all time. I think I spoke for at least 4 minutes longer than I had to. At a minimum. This review could have been under 10 minutes by far. But you know what? I don't get enough time to just chat nowadays, right? It's all about the book reviews. Be sure to like, subscribe if you like the video, you want to see more like it in the future. And as always, thanks for sticking around.